right, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Devon McFadden. I'm so excited you're all here to talk about self-love. That's obviously what today's webinar is all about. We just celebrated Valentine's Day, which is, of course, typically about love for others in your life. But I'm hoping to show you why self-love is just as important. And if you've been to my webinars before, you know that they're quick. They're packed full of exercises, and you can leave here today practicing some self-love immediately. So thanks so much for being here and taking some time out of your evening. I'm really grateful to you. And let's get started. Quickly about me. Again, I'm Devon McFadden. I'm the owner of a small company called Make Eating Easy, where I'm an intuitive eating coach. I help folks with a whole spectrum of eating issues. I have my master's in public health. I'm a certified intuitive eating counselor and health education specialist. I'm also personally a foodie and a home cook. I love cooking and baking. My whole life seems to be about food, apparently. But I bring this up not to talk about credentials, but to show you that everything we're talking about today is backed up by science. And if I can learn it, you all can learn it too. I want to start with some definitions. First of all, self-love, and then part of that is self-compassion. My last webinar, I talked a lot about self-compassion and what that looked like with body image. How that self-compassion works with self-love is a little bit different. But I wanted to share a quote with you for self-love and for self-compassion because they said it so perfectly. To start with self-love, self-love means having a high regard for your own well-being and happiness. Self-love means taking care of your own needs and not sacrificing your well-being to please others. Self-love means not settling for less than you deserve. Sometimes people think of self-love as a little new agey or lovey-dovey or sentimental even. But to me, it's really about knowing your value, learning what your value is, maybe discovering your worth, and then standing up for that. It can be really difficult as an occasional people pleaser speaking to you, but it's really important and it's worth working on. Self-compassion is slightly different, but works together. As a note, self-compassion is the more researched of the two concepts. But again, this quote is perfect. I couldn't say it better myself. Instead of mercilessly judging and criticizing yourself for various inadequacies or shortcomings, self-compassion means you are kind and understanding when confronted with personal failings. After all, whoever said you were supposed to be perfect? I love that quote. It's so great because we forget all the time that we're not supposed to be perfect, even when we're experts at things. Kristen Neff, who said the self-compassion quote, is the authority on self-compassion, the researcher. I highly recommend her book if you're interested in some of these concepts in a little more depth. So at their core, very simply, self-compassion is being kind to yourself. And that can ultimately lead to self-love, knowing your worth and standing up for your worth. I get this question sometimes, so I wanted to start with it, lead with it. Isn't self-love just narcissism? Again, forgive me for the quotes. These people just say these things so well. Loving yourself doesn't mean you think you're the smartest, most talented, and most beautiful person in the world. Instead, when you love yourself, you accept your so-called weaknesses, appreciate those so-called shortcomings as something that makes you who you are. When you love yourself, you have compassion for yourself. So it works the other way too. When you're being kind to yourself, you also are feeding into self-love. When you experience a great deal of self-love, you're also typically being kind to yourself. To me, self-love is the opposite of narcissism. It's not about being cocky. It's about knowing that you're human and that you make mistakes, but that you're also worthy of love and you're also worthy of feeling good about yourself. And setting boundaries as well is an important part of that. Another good question that comes up quite often is, isn't self-love just giving up? So self-love is acceptance. I am exactly who I am with all of my faults, and I'm accepting and okay of that. So isn't that just giving up? There's no more growth. I'm accepting myself exactly as I am. My answer is a big no. So remember the definition of self-love. You're not settling for less than you deserve. An example, maybe from my own life, is let's say that you're stubborn and you'd like to be less stubborn. Saying, I am a horrible person because I am so stubborn, being really self-critical, won't help you be less stubborn. And you will also feel terrible about yourself because you've just insulted yourself in a way that you would never have insulted a friend. But accepting the stubbornness, saying, I am stubborn, it's something I would like to improve in certain capacities in my life, makes it easier for me to accomplish that goal of reducing stubbornness. And I also don't feel terrible about myself in the process. So self-love is not about giving up. It's about accepting and then also coming up with plans for growth. I want to take a quick step back about where self-loathing and self-criticism come from. This is also reminiscent of my last webinar, so forgive me if you're hearing this twice, but I do think it's important to know if you're experiencing self-criticism, that it's not exactly your fault. It's not your fault at all, I should say. At the heart of it for me and for a lot of researchers, a lot of other people doing what I'm doing as well, self-loathing and self-criticism typically come from media. So we have had traditional media for a lot of time, radio, TV, those kinds of things, and then increasingly social media. And there's tons of research on both social and traditional media and their impacts on self-loathing and self-criticism. I won't bore you with all of that. It is out there if you're curious to dig more into it. But I did want to reference a couple of studies. The first is a study out of Fiji in the 1970s. Researchers brought TV, thin ideal, and when I say thin ideal, I mean that in our culture, thinner is more preferable. So Western thin ideal media to Fiji. And the Fijians had not been exposed to that thin ideal Western media at that point. Their research found there was literally a direct correlation between a rise in eating disorders and exposure to media. Okay, that kind of line. The more thin ideal media that these women, I should say, were exposed to, the higher the rates of eating disorders, where they hadn't been present on the island up until that point. This research is obviously wildly unethical. I hope it would not happen today, but it illustrates how self-loathing, self-criticism are learned behaviors. It's not something anyone is inherently born with. Social media, I don't have a specific study to reference, but there's lots of research showing that higher usage of social media leads to higher rates of depression and anxiety, especially amongst younger people, preteens and teens, but across the age spectrum as well. And then, of course, these ideas, when we see them in media, are reinforced by friends and family and at work and school. Friends and family and work and school are all people, and we're all watching the same thing. What you see regularly is what you come to believe. But the insidious part of self-loathing and self-criticism is that ultimately you don't need any of those first 3 bullet points. It's reinforced by ourselves. Once you believe you're not good enough, you don't need anyone telling you that to believe it. So why choose self-love when it's kind of a radical act these days? Difficulty in life is inevitable. Others doubting you is inevitable. But self-love is how you can best weather this storm called life and to show up for those you love. It's almost become cliche, but it's true. You have to take care of yourself to best serve others, whether that's your kids, your partner, at work, at school. You have to take care of yourself in order to show up for other people. Plus, there are a lot of good benefits of self-compassion according to research, just on a personal level. It leads to overall improved health, particularly mental health overall. So less depression and anxiety, higher rates of self-esteem, improved body image, which I talk a lot about in my work, as you can imagine. It also fosters resilience, self-worth, motivation. Self-compassion is legitimate, it's well-researched, and it is the way to go. Anecdotally means I cannot back it up with research, but in my own life, in the life of friends and family and of clients, when I talk to them about these kinds of issues, having high rates of self-love or self-compassion, it's a happier and a calmer way to live. I find that people are much easier to forgive and forget, or to at least forgive if they can't forget. To bounce back quicker from falls, not physical ones, but emotional ones. Some of that, anything that happens that sets you off your feet in life. And then I think it also leads to quicker growth. Having a high regard for your well-being, which is part of the definition of self-love, means that you take care of yourself. And that also means that you're growing over time. So now on to these activities, which I love. I think it's really helpful to come out of things with, here's what I can start doing right now. So where do you start? I have 3 activities for you. The first 2 are a little bit easier, perhaps a little bit more fun. The third one is probably a lifetime of work, but I think it's a really powerful portrayal of what you might think of as self-love versus what I think self-love actually is. So let's get started with this first one. Oh, too soon. One note. Please don't expect improvements overnight. This is not meant to be a webinar of exercises that make you feel worse because you're not doing self-love well enough. That's not what this is supposed to be about. It can be so difficult to just flip a switch from a lot of self-criticism to self-love overnight. So please be patient with you. Know that this stuff is really hard, even when you've practiced, but it is worth it. Okay, first activity. The first bullet point is so much fun because we don't have a space in life where we typically do anything like this. We're working on improving ourselves a lot of the time. But number 1, very simply, make a list of everything you like about yourself. That I'm saying is literally anything that you like about yourself, your personality, your values, your friends, your family, whatever that is. Make an exhaustive list. Put some time into thinking about everything that you like about who you are. And then save that list, whether it's on your phone or you're physically writing it down. I like to write stuff down. Save it, reference it every day for at least a week, and then every few days after that. And then, of course, add to the list when you think of something else. If you're at work or Zoom or whatever it looks like, and you go, oh, I forgot I am pretty good at this thing, add it to the list. This is supposed to be exhaustive. And it's supposed to bring awareness to, in a world where self-criticism is normal, going, I actually really like who I am and I like what I'm about. I have a note here for no commentary, especially in retrospect. So we all have days where we're down. Don't say, well, I thought I was generous when I wrote that originally, but turns out I am not that generous. That's not what this is about. If you thought it at one point, leave it on the list, and there's some piece of that that's true for you. So you can just stop at 1 if you want. Stop here, particularly if you're really struggling with self-criticism. It's probably not helpful to go on to 2 and 3 yet. The first one will be good for absolutely every single person. When you get to number 2, if you decide you want to move forward, make a list of areas where you want to grow or change. And then column 3, why haven't you done this thing yet? Not in a critical way, literally the reason why you haven't made this particular change, or you've maybe thought about learning French and you haven't done it yet. Make sure it's only reasons that are kind. If you write something unkind, change it. Especially if you're typing it out, it's easy. Cross it out if you're writing it. If you look down, you're like, that wasn't the nicest thing I could have said, switch it. A good example of something that's kind to say for this third column is, I haven't made time yet, but I've written it down. I'm aware that I want to do it. I'm going to come up with a plan for how I'm going to do that. It's simple. It's not being critical of, I'm terrible that I haven't come up with this plan yet. It's a really nice way to go, how would I like to move forward and accomplish what I want to accomplish out of life? Number 2, also kind of fun, reference a self-care list. And I'm going to show you one on the next slide, one that I've come up with. There's tons of them online. You don't need to use the one I'm about to show you. But what you're going to do is literally, it's a checklist. Make a note of all the things for self-care that you are currently doing regularly. I don't have a definition of regularly. I don't have a definition of currently. Whatever that means to you, just go with it. But check off all the things you're doing. And then pick at least one, probably starting with one that you want to add to your life. It's easy to, when you're looking at a checklist, to go, I'm going to do these 6 things. It's much easier to stick to doing just one self-care activity. And don't feel bad if you're not checking off a lot of the things on the next list. That's what this is for, is trying to add a little bit of self-love and a little bit of self-care into your life. When you start doing self-care, that is a good way to support your self-love practice. Here are the most important, according to research I've read. Meditation. So any kind of mindfulness, not necessarily meditation, but being in the here and now is really good for your emotional well-being. I love the Calm app. There's a ton of apps out there. A lot of people like Headspace too. You can also, if you just want to look up some meditations for free, I think it's helpful to have a guided meditation if you're just getting started, but go to YouTube. There's tons of them. You can do meditation for body image, meditation for a hard time at work. You know, you can come up with whatever is going on in your life, or just do something simple like intro meditation, and someone will guide you through what that looks like. Number 2 is sleep. And I actually think sleep, I probably should have had be the first one. I heard recently on the radio, sleep is nature's therapy. In my own experience, anecdotally, if I've been really stressed about something, I sleep, and then the next day I can look at it more rationally. And they've started doing research to show that that is true of most people. So it's also lack of sleep, as I think we all know, but find it difficult to practice, can lead to a whole host of health issues, and getting good quality sleep can support your life in a really meaningful way. Movement. I don't mean to send you to the gym and to have you stress out about lifting weights when you've hated that in the past. It's simply doing anything that you love. It's gardening, or if you're cleaning your house, or, you know, whatever that looks like for you, maybe going for a walk with your dog. Movement is really supportive of self-care and ultimately self-love. Here's the list that I use with my clients. So you can see anything from journaling to making time to relax, to reading a book, not looking at screens for a day, drink enough water, things like that. So look at a list, either this one, you can come back and reference it. This is going to, be on YouTube. But you can reference this, or there's plenty of these online. You can find an exhaustive self-care list as well in another place. So we're on to the third and probably more in depth, more lifelong, maybe more difficult practice. And I don't say that to scare you off, but the first two, this is a little more in depth than going, I'm going to read a book. Not to be dismissive of that. That's really important. But you'll see as we go through it, that's a little more intense work. I got this from positivepsychology.com, which I've been using this for some time for myself as well. And I think it's a really helpful tool. So let's go back to that quote on self-love. Self-love means having a high regard for your own well-being and happiness. Self-love means taking care of your own needs and not sacrificing your well-being to please others. Self-love means not settling for less than you deserve. I think this acronym is a really supportive way to begin making some of those changes to emulate that definition. So it stands FAST, it's the FAST acronym. It stands for be fair, no apologies, stick to values, and be truthful. I'd encourage you to write these down or print it out, whatever is best for you, and put it somewhere or have it in your phone, somewhere where you can just look and remember, like you're in a situation or you've just experienced something going, did I live according to that? It's a really helpful tool to reference and then gets easier over time. So starting with be fair. Be fair to yourself. I think we think of being fair as being fair to others often, but being fair and kind to yourself is part of self-compassion. Being fair is also about being assertive, setting boundaries, and speaking your truth. Notice it doesn't mean being cruel, rude, or unkind. I didn't say any of those things. I think assertive can be misinterpreted. Brene Brown actually had a quote that I love. I'm forgetting which book, but she says, clear is kind. When you think of kindness, it's not being a pushover, it's being very clear, and that's being fairer to someone and being fairer to yourself. No apologies. Don't apologize unless you have something to be sorry for. This is really difficult for a Minnesotan like me. My husband teases me because someone could run into me on the street, knock me to the ground, and I would be the one apologizing. It's just in Minnesotans' DNA. But the goal is to not apologize unless you have something to say sorry for. No apologies for opinions or disagreements. That means not saying, I'm sorry, but I don't agree. Disagreements or opinions are valid and important, and they help you stick to your values, which is the next one down. This is about not abandoning yourself to please others. And I think I added this part about discovering your values. It was kind of hard for me to articulate values for a while when I first heard about them. I think everyone has heard of values, but to actually hear people go, these are my top 2 values and how I choose to live my life, I didn't have that for a long time. I didn't exactly know how to find that. So I actually found a really helpful worksheet, to quote Brene Brown again. And if you just Google Brene Brown worksheet values, it'll pop up. It's an exercise to go through. You circle everything that you find kind of is in line with your values, and then you whittle it down until you get to your very top values. And you can keep doing that over time and refining. I've had some that have stuck for the entire time, and then some things that I've adjusted. But it's about knowing your values. That comes back to that quote about self-love again. And the last one is be truthful. That means no big lies and no white lies. I think that's hard for everyone. White lies are a big part of life, I find sometimes. But it's as much about being honest with yourself. So if you don't like where you're at in life, it's about being kind about it. You're being kind to yourself. We've talked about that. But you're being truthful about where you are and where you want to go. So this is an exercise, like I said, that I think for me will be a lifelong exercise. It's a struggle. These are kind of core things to figure out. that might be a little more nuanced than self-care or keeping lists of things that you like about yourself, which are also very important. But this, I think, is kind of the heart of what self-love is, and it's the heart of how you can be the person that you really are to the world, and present that person in the same way to yourself and to others. The key here is lots of practice. I fall short time and time again, especially with that FAST acronym, but I'm aware of it, and I come back to it. I reference it all the time. I'm always striving to do better with it. So even for people that talk about this stuff for a living, it's hard to put into practice in your daily life. So don't beat yourself up. Keep practicing it. And when you fall short, keep practicing it some more. Here's some of the work cited for this webinar. Again, if you are really interested in some of this, I highly recommend the book Self-Compassion by Kristen Neff. And you can go back and reference all of these later and reach out to me if you have questions about other research as well. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your night to be here. I am always available. My email's right there. Reach out with any questions you have. I hope you learned something. I hope you'll take these exercises and run with them. Self-love is a difficult thing to learn in a world that wants us to be really critical of ourselves. And I find self-criticism is easier. But I think working to practice self-love and self-compassion has been transformative for me and for a lot of others that I know. So hopefully you got a few things out of it. I also I'm about to launch a poll. So while I'm answering some questions here, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I will get to all of them. I'm going to put a poll up on the screen. Let us know if you thought this webinar was helpful, how we could improve it. Feel free to do that while I'm answering some questions here. Okay. So I'm going to start with a question that I get quite often. How long does it take to actually start feeling self-love? Not intellect. I think it's easier to understand this stuff intellectually, but to actually feel it and start practicing it. I have the worst answer for that all the time, which is that it takes time. And it also depends person to person, how long you've struggled, what's going on in your life. It does click eventually, but it just takes time, and it really does look different for each person. So I have a very unsatisfying answer to a common question. I'm sorry about that. So again, feel free, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. Oh, I have a couple good questions here. Really thoughtful, interesting ones. So the first one is, does self-love mean loving the self-critical side of you? I would say that self-love, I would say self-compassion is a bit more on the side of loving the self-critical side of you, just being kind and knowing that it's there. Self-love is about learning how to get away from that criticism, though, in my opinion, about figuring out why you're being critical, first of all, and then how to move away from that into a place that might be a little bit more supportive and a little bit kinder. And ultimately, I think that leads to a happier place. So self-love, does self-love mean loving the self-critical side of you? I think it means being aware of it and trying to work on moving away from it to a happier spot. One more question. How do you recommend managing self-love while avoiding complacency? So we talked about that a little bit. I get that question all the time. That might be the most common thing people ask me when this comes up. That's when we talked about, does self-love equal giving up? I don't think that self-love, that by loving yourself, that means that you can't grow. I understand how it can be interpreted that way for sure, but I think um, part of loving yourself and part of self-love as an actual term and something we can work towards is about finding your values, knowing your self-worth. And I think part of that self-worth is growth. For me, it certainly is about growth. I think growth in life is very important to me and probably to a lot of people. So it's as much about being kind to yourself while you're growing and while you're failing, while you're trying to grow. So I don't think that self-love and complacency are one and the same. I think you can do self-love and also be growing at the same time. Hopefully that makes sense. Another question, can others help me in my self-love journey, or is this something I have to do on my own? That's a really good question. I would highly recommend, especially if you're struggling with being very self-critical, that you reach out to a therapist or a counselor of some kind, specifically on this point. That's where I got my start learning about some of these concepts and activities, and then I translate them into the world of eating typically. So there are a lot of resources and activities. I just showed you a handful to get started with. But if you're feeling like you're doing them and it's not really making a dent for you, you may need to seek out some therapy or counseling. I think that field would probably be the most supportive and the most helpful on the journey, a self-love journey, on a self-compassion journey. But I do highly recommend, if you're not ready to go down that route, or if that feels really expensive right now, Kristen Neff's book, Self-Compassion, is chock full of exercises and has a ton of research and is a really, really awesome resource. Any other questions? I want to thank you all so much for being here. I had a ton of fun. Oh, someone said thank you. This was great. I had a great time. Hopefully you all got some resources and exercises out of it. Please reach out to me if you're confused about anything, or if you want some more resources or some more help talking through some of these concepts. I'm happy to help. I'm happy to steer you in the direction of other resources as well. Thanks so much.